And thank you for that wonderful introduction to the field of material science. And so at Brandeis, we have one of these National Science Foundation Materials Research Science and Engineering Centers, but we have no engineering at Brandeis. And so as you alluded to, your material science department is a 50% mix between engineering and science. Our materials research center is really focused on the basic science, and the kind of material applications we foresee will be, some decades out. But just as in the prior presentation you saw the first transistor, that came in the 50s, so the quantum mechanics that led to that solid state electronics was invented in the 20s, so you have these kind of arc of 30 years before the first prototype, and then another decade before commercialization. So kind of these 40-year spans between the basic science and the application. And in that first presentation, you saw every one of the components was made out of atoms or molecules, each of which are inanimate objects. And here we're going to consider a whole new class of materials where the building objects, the molecules, are animate. And animate does not mean living. Animate means you have animation, you have motion. And in order to have motion, you have to be out of equilibrium. You have to be consuming energy and then converting that energy into motion. And that's in contradiction to every category of material that was in the traditional talk that preceded. And even the fundamental theoretical foundation for this new class of materials is not entirely known. That field is still under rapid development. And then the first experimental systems are also in their very early day. But then these materials show really interesting behaviors. And I'll first go through some of the kinds of behaviors that we're envisioning that will emerge from this new category of materials. So there was a review article that came out last year by two of my colleagues. Both of these were undergraduates at Brandeis, and both worked in my lab. Now Needleman is a faculty at Harvard and Dojic at UCSB. But they're talking about materials where the units themselves are internally driven. So they call this machines made from machines. This is a quote, a paraphrase of Leibniz from 1710, who said his definition of what a living organism was as distinct from a man-made machine is that living organisms are machines made from machines. So your cells are like little machines that can crawl, and then the cells make tissue, the tissue make organs, the organs build up into organisms. At every level of hierarchical assembly, you're a machine that's made from machines. So that's kind of this one definition. And so it turns out there'd be fundamental new principles emerge when you're looking at matter that's made from living. And so, so kind of the science fiction type thing we're imagining is that like you have these little nanites where each, is a programmed machine, and then they can collectively kind of assemble into, another kind of machines. And at the end of the talk, I'll show you one that we created last year and was published in Science. That was one of these first examples of machines made of machines that perform work and do functions. So this is one example of a machine made of machines. So, a flock of starlings coming to roost at sunset. And, you look at this blob of matter. It looks like a drop of water. It looks kind of like that assembling T-1000 Terminator in the previous slide. And people we're studying these kinds of collective behaviors and looking at it from the perspective of fluid hydrodynamics, that you could think of this as some kind of a fluid. And I'll say a little bit more about those theoretical underpinnings in a moment, but I just want to show a few more examples from the living world. But we're going to very rapidly move away from the living world. So here's an aerial view of a flock of sheep. And again, you get this kind of collective behavior. There's a directionality. They look at their neighbors, and they see what angle the neighbor is going, and they kind of move at the average, in the average direction as the nearest neighbors, with a kind of a constant velocity. And then if there's a barrier, then they kind of flow and come through that barrier and expand, just like fluid going through a nozzle. There's surface tension. There's certain concepts that immediately you recognize as a kind of a fluid, a thixotropic fluid, kind of like a toothpaste coming through a tube. And then the question is that more than just a metaphor? So here's, I mean, we have in English, you have just all these wonderful words, right? I mean, a flock of birds, a herd of sheep, a school of fish. I don't know why there's a different, does anyone know why we have different names for each of these organizations?
I do, actually. For the silly collective nouns were a competition among noble people who hunted for fun once upon a time.
I was not a rhetorical question. I need to be schooled on this. And we're librarians. Yeah, so you just kind of marvel at this, and you wonder, first of all, you wonder, is there a collective intelligence, you kind of think maybe one hypothesis is that there's not a collective intelligence, guiding them into these schools. And then you would say, well, then how do they communicate and coordinate? And, those are kind of questions that one asks, again, not rhetorically. This one is called the death spiral. So they'll continue for as long as you've got RAM in your camera and batteries. And so there's this great quote from this journal, American Museum. I don't even know how to pronounce that. On the spot of yesterday's phenomena, little or no circling is to be seen. The entire area is strewn with the bodies of dead and dying escitons. That's the species of ants. A few of the survivors wander about slowly, and an hour later, the notebook continues. Virtually none of the ants are on their feet. They just follow the leader, and then if they get stuck in a circle, then, it's bad news. And so, I started off with kind of big animals, and then moving down, now we're at single cell. These are bacteria swarms, sped up. They, form this kind of herding behavior. I don't know did the nobles come up with a name for?
I'm not sure they could see.
And so I think I would call that a herd of, a swarm of bacteria is what swarm of bacteria. So now we move down to the bacteria was a single cell, and this is subcellular. So this is inside a single cell where you have this cytoplasmic streaming. And there's a certain part in the mouse embryo where the cells are dividing, and if you don't get this kind of flow, then your heart ends up on the wrong side. There's a condition, the medical librarians will know the name of that condition. And it's caused by this flow field breaking down. And we want to make, so as engineers, we want to build materials that have this kind of property. So this is a leukocyte, it's chasing that bacteria, and it's pushing away the neutrophils out of the way. And so it's got a sensory organ, it's got an actuator, it's got some fuel supply, and it's just going to search and then eventually destroy the poor bacteria. And so we want to make materials like this. Here's one cell dividing. Here's cilia on the surface of a single protozoan that's showing these rhythmic waves and swimming. And so we want to understand how to make such objects, from the bottom up, with a minimum number of components. And so the theoretical field kind of starts with continuum mechanics and hydrodynamics. And so this was developed in the 19th century, 1850s. And when we talk about continuum theory, we're now imagining matter not to be composed of atoms, but to be just a continuous field of properties. And so if you're describing the flow of fluids, you would say you have the velocity of each parcel of fluid. So you imagine, as Leonardo, water flowing through a spout and then into a basin and creating this kind of turbulence. And you could imagine, like, at each point in this basin of water, there would be a little arrow that tells you the direction of the velocity of that fluid, and the length of the arrow would tell you how fast it's moving. And a continuum theory would tell you at every point in space, no matter how closely together that velocity field is. And it would also, in this formalism of continuum hydrodynamics, tell you the pressure at every point in space. And of course, eventually you get down to atoms, and there's a molecule, and then there's space, and so in the space, nothing's moving. It's vacuum, and then where the atom is, it's moving. But the philosophy of continuum mechanics is that as long as you're maybe, let's say, looking at length scales that are 10 atoms big, 10 atoms up to the size of the universe, you can just treat it as a continuum, and you don't have to worry about the particulate nature. And this tremendously simplifies the theoretical description, because in 1 cubic centimeter you have 10 to the 20 atoms, and if you have to track every one of those atoms, then you're never going to build an airplane that's going to fly, because you can never compute that many atoms and where they're moving. So this continuum mechanics is a idealization and a simplification, and therefore it's a falsification. But it retains what's necessary in order to, engineer our world. And so you have this kind of tension between these continuum theories and the particulate theory. The particulate theory is where you go down to each atom and you move up. The continuum theory is where you can describe things at this much more idealized level. And the kind of really profound thing about continuum theories is that they're always true in some mathematical sense, because the theory that describes this flow, you can describe this flow in great accuracy. The theory that describes this flow is based solely on these very general principles of symmetry. That's to say that, if I have the laws of physics, if I pour a glass of water in this room or I pour a glass of water in the next room, it's going to pour the same. If I take the same beaker of, and I pour the same coffee into the same cup, it's going to do the same thing no matter what room I'm in. So that's called translational invariance. And using these kinds of symmetry principles, you can greatly circumscribe what possible motions the water can have. And, but you can't tell like how fast the water would flow. That depends on the viscosity, how much friction there is, and there you have to do a measurement. So these continuum theories are incredibly powerful and general and true, but the cost is you don't know what these phenomenological constants are, like viscosity. Is it water or honey? You have to do experiment. Or you have to do a particulate level experiment where you measure, 2 honey atoms or 2 water atoms and how sticky they are together. And so, so this is where you are. This is the underlying basis which was worked out in the 19th century for all of the material science. And it lets you do things like sit in this airplane without it ever being tested in a wind tunnel. This thing's completely designed in the computer without, because those equations are so good, those continuum mechanics equations. And you can do experiments on airfoils, and you see all these details of these vortices being shed from the wingtips that you see now imprinted in the clouds by the twin vortices that are shed from the tips of this. And if you do a numerical simulation of these hydrodynamic equations, you get exactly the same thing, and it gives you the lift. And so these general principles are, every time you take a flight, you're putting your life in the hands of those continuum equations, and they don't fail. They're just awesome. So, but what happens when you try to do the same thing with the living organisms? Whole new rules of physics come in, and the mathematics and physics of those equations was unknown. It started about 20 years ago where people started studying those flocks, and they started with this model, 1995, the Visek model, where he made a very, very simple model where he said the birds, I'm a bird, I want to fly, I just want to fly, follow my nose, my beak. I just want to fly in the direction of my beak. And then I look to my left and my right, and I just go in the average direction of my neighbors. And then that gives you all this flocking behavior, just those simple rules. But these are particle rules. And then about 2 years later, some physicists figured out how you can take these particle rules and convert it into these continuum equations and make the analog to those equations that describe the airplane flow, but now at this continuum level where you can really make models. And so then now you needed to test these. And so people now made artificial systems that had these are colloidal particles that are doing some chemical catalysis. They're eating some fuel that's in the water, and they're moving they just like the birds. They move in a certain direction, and then they flock, and they flock for the same reasons that the birds do. And so people started around 2010 developing these experimental systems. And so at Brandeis, we developed one based on biological units. So we go to the slaughterhouse. We start with cow brains. You have to get warm brains because otherwise the microtubules deteriorate. So you get a bag of warm brains, and then we bring them back to the lab. They go into a blender, and you then go through this set of like 24-hour purification to get the microtubules. The microtubules are railroad tracks for neurotransmitters to go from the cell body, which is in your brain, to like if you're a cow and you want to wag your tail, or I want to say toe. It's not, they don't have toes. Hoof. Move your hoof. You've got like one long neuron that goes from your brain down the spine to your hoof. And the neurotransmitters have to be transported from where they're synthesized in the brain to the hoof. And way that's done is you have this railroad track called a microtubule, and then you have these motors that walk along the microtubule, and they attach to a cargo. So in an artist's conception, here's the microtubule, here's the cargo, which is it's like a mayonnaise. It's like an emulsion. You know, like when you make a mayonnaise with oil and mustard and vinegar, and then inside it, instead of mustard, you have your serotonin. And then you have this motor, kinesin, which walks on the microtubule, and it consumes energy. To do walks, you have to consume energy. And so you have to be out of equilibrium. So you can't use the old kinds of equations of continuum mechanics. You have to use these new form to describe this kind of material that's always out of equilibrium. And so we make such a system by synthesizing these kinesin clusters, where these are motors that walk, when they consume energy, they walk to the plus end. And so if you make a two-headed motor, it just walks to the end, no force is produced. But if you take these microtubules and you have them counter-aligned, because the motors always walk to the plus end, and if they're bound to each other, then as they walk in opposite direction, they're going to exert a force. And then that's going to cause these microtubules to slide and extend. And that's our force-generating object. So so here's a very dilute concentration where you see if they come together and they're aligned, then nothing happens. But if they're counter-aligned, then they extend. Okay, they consume energy and produce force. And now if you can measure how much force by attaching, so these are single molecules, just a few nanometers in diameter, but they're very long, so you can image them. And then you can, with biochemical techniques, you can attach a handle to each end, and then you can hold that handle with a focused laser beam. So these are called tweezers, optical tweezers, that will supply a few piconewtons of force. So you can hold on to them, and you can measure how much force it takes to pull apart these tubes. So we can have all the constants of how much energy is consumed and how much force is generated in these systems. And so then we can put high concentrations of these. And so if we did not give this any fuel, it eats ATP, and just like you do when you have lunch, you're generating ATP for your muscles to work, then this would just be a cross-linked gel. It would just be a static polymer. It would just be like the seat cushion, it would be just sitting there. If you sit on it, it will, resist you, but it's not gonna push you out of your seat. It's not gonna come over and kick you. But this stuff will, okay? So this stuff, you feed it, it will, it'll knock you about. You can see it just keeps moving on its own forever. You're not stirring it externally, it's stirring itself. And so it's an active gel. So kind of the role of our center is to activate every ordinary material. So you can have a liquid crystal, passive, now we make an active liquid crystal. You can have a gel, make an active gel. You can have an emulsion, make an active emulsion. Have a polymer, make an active polymer. And then each new category of material will have unique and new properties that have never been seen before, except in living systems. And so then here's a study we did where we took this gel and we confined it. So here we zoom in on a microscope. This is 100 microns, so this is the diameter of a hair. And we flow in this suspension and we let it go. And after a few minutes, it develops this chaotic, turbulent, flowing network. So instead of being a static gel, it just starts flowing in turbulent motion. But there's no net directed fluid transport. It's just turbulent, like a river that's flowing very rapidly, and you get all these eddies and currents, just turbulent. And now if you zoom out 10 times, so now before we were just looking in this tiny little section here. Now we zoom out, you just see this kind of violent flailing activity, that was running. And it will run, for hours and hours and hours because we have an ATP regenerative system that keeps providing fuel. ATP is the fuel, it's the gasoline that drives this engine. If we put none in, then it's completely static. And here we put in little tiny 1 micron sized beads, and you see they don't move, but as you add more and more fuel, you can get all kinds of convective motion. So now we want to generate coherent flow, so we confine them into these channels, and now you can tame the turbulence by somehow confining it. And the theories said that this couldn't happen, and this will just continue for hours and hours and hours until the fuel's consumed, and then it stops. And then, we can make many of them and, get them to go in different directions, and you can engineer all kinds of different flow patterns. And so the question was, well, what caused them to flow? Why are sometimes they're turbulent and sometimes you get this net jetting flow? And so that was a fundamental question in the theory. And and when we were first doing these experiments, we had no clue about what was causing it to flow. But we reasoned that it was pushing off the walls. So we thought if we make these ratchets, then we should be able to control the direction of flow. And indeed, that was the case, that if we made ratchets this way, one-handedness, the flow would go this way, and made the ratchets the other way, then we could get the flow to go the other way. So we could engineer the flows. And then kind of one of the funny things is that, I thought, the more ratchets you have, the more better. Because if a ratchet determines the flow, if you have 10 ratchets, you're going to get 10 times more flow. Well, it just goes the opposite. The more ratchets you have, the slower it flows. And then when we went in detail and we measured the velocity field, you could see that around each ratchet, there was this kind of created a vortex. And then this backflow slows down the main flow, and then, so it's better to just have one ratchet than many ratchets. And then, we looked in detail what's going on, and what we found is that the wall produces order. So these tubes, these fundamental tubes, they want to extend outwards, but in both directions. But if there's a wall, they can't do that. And so then they only extend in one way. But they could just as well extend to the left or to the right. But once they start to flow, they comb all the hair. You think of these fibers as like hair, but hair that's growing super fast, and because they're extending. And then if it starts flowing and there's a little spontaneous fluctuation, so that more point to the left than the right, then they push more from the right to the left, and then you get this positive feedback where it combs itself and creates higher flow, combing more, and then you get this kind of engine. So it's a self-assembling, self-organizing pump. So, and then we got the theory working, and the theory could kind of capture, I don't want to go into all the details, but it gets, 90% of it right, but we're still not completely there with the theory and the experiment. So this is still work under progress. But we went ahead and we made a sample. This was a couple brains worth. So this is a 1 meter long pipe where it's flowing. It's a self-organized pump. So it's kind of like that Terminator thing. It just assembles by itself. Normally, if you want to pump something from an oil field, you have to have one of these big, you see them around LA, one of these big, they look like a dinosaur, or those circulating pumps that, and then push things through pipes. To get things to flow through pipe, you have to apply pressure, you have to generate a pump. Here, the engine assembles itself. You just add fuel, 1 part in 1,000 microtubules to 999 parts water, and it organizes itself where it aligns along the interface, forming this kind of conduit that then pushes all the water with it. So it's a self-organized, machine made out of machines. The whole thing's a pump, but it's made out of little tiny nanites, on the nanoscale that are extending and then build this system. And so, so that's this new field that's kind of looking at cell biology for inspiration, but then just taking a few of the components and then reassembling them in order to create these artificial systems. And so then, what are the applications? This is where we really need the engineers to come in and start thinking about, what one can do with this type of thing. But I think they're, a few years out. But you can imagine all these desirable attributes that we're surrounded by in the living environment. Now we can tame and put under our control as engineers and build kind of such materials with lifelike functionality. So I think I'd like to stop at this point. I have a whole other section on another example, but it's just more of these self-organized, flowing, kind of awesome, living-like attributes. So this was from a gel, making it active. I have a whole other section on liquid crystals, which are the passive liquid crystals are the awesome things in your displays. And then when you make them active, they do even crazier things than they do in your laptops. But I think you get the gist of it. And so I'd like to stop at this point. Thank you.
So we've got the lav mic.
Shall we turn off the...
I will actually put up the evaluation screen, yes. So I'll unplug your laptop. Questions? We've got lots of time for questions.
I was just kind of curious, how would you, for a younger generation, how would you, encourage them to become material science people? Should they just be, to play with Legos, chemistry sets? How would you encourage them to go into this field?
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Is this working? All right. I think any aptitude for science or engineering is a good channel into material science and engineering because we do all those things. So the building side, yes, the Legos, the circuit toys, all that stuff is conducive, right? And also the basic science, the chemistry set, the rock tumbler, all the things that are predictors for science and engineering play in material science and engineering. I don't think, it's a good question. I kind of wish I had material-centric toys for my own kids. But I don't think there's anything special. But if they have that aptitude, making them aware that this is a field and a discipline I think that's a service to them, and I think in the long run to humanity if we can sort of educate students early about this field. Oh, do you want the true answer or the PR answer? The question was, how did I get into this field? And so I'm going to give you the Professor Shu answer first, which is that so this is the right field for me because it sits at this interface of science and engineering. I always really liked physics. I always really liked the idea of being able to do computer simulations of quantum effects, and I really wanted to operate an electron microscope, and I really wanted to do all the basic science stuff, but I didn't just want to produce science. I wanted to actually make products. And so if you're looking to integrate from atoms to products, this is the field to be in. This is the field where that happens. It's sort of what we do all the time. So that's sort of my professional answer. And then I'll give you the truthful answer, which is that when I went to school, I went to the state school because it's what I could afford to do. And I went into engineering because I thought I might get a job and be able to pay off the debt. And then when I got there as a freshman, they gave me a Scantron sheet, and they said, pick a major. And I just looked at this list, and I didn't have the benefit of STEM education. I didn't know what any of them were, like civil engineering, mechanical engineering. I don't know what any of these are. And materials engineering, material science and engineering, I don't even think I've heard those words put together before. So, what the hell? I checked that box, and I stumbled into the field, and only later did I discover that I really loved it, and it was the right place for me. But that's the truthful answer. We're not filming that, are we?
I mean, I think largely there's a lot of contingency in the decisions we make in life, but also in academics. I also could have been very comfortable doing solid state electronics or high energy physics. I think any science I would love doing. And I also, so I would say also it was by randomness that I ended up.
It's a field that I think most of us probably haven't heard of. I mean, you hear of teachers, lawyers, doctors.
But it's an engineer.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's a field that I hadn't heard of before and wasn't aware of, so that's why I was curious about that.
I'll add one more thing. So I know why students at MIT choose this discipline over others, because we survey them constantly. We're constantly trying to figure out what appeals to them. And in the current generation, those who come into the field come into it for the narrative. They're narrative driven, the current generation. They like the idea that they can follow their passion for science and engineering, but that it will contribute to some societal good. They like the fact that the field connects to so many of the big problems that are under discussion in the broader society. They sort of love the narrative and that their work can align with a societal narrative. So if you have a youngster in your life who is sort of interested in, having fun in their work, doing engineering, doing science, but also feeling like they're contributing to the world, it is a good field. That's why students come into it.
How much of your grants belong to you, how much of your non-grant patents belong to you, and how much of them belongs to the MIT?
The patents?
Yeah.
Oh,
patents.
MIT owns all the patents, right? So I'm an employee of MIT, and part of my employment agreement is that my work product is owned by MIT. One thing that MIT does well is they have a licensing office that connects to the industry and does licenses to make sure that it gets out. And the MIT philosophy on patents is the following. They want to write as many licenses as possible. They want to do high volume licensing. So what they don't do is negotiate to try to make a bunch of money off of it. In fact, very few patents make much money. We're trying to run sort of a break-even operation on patents in principle, so as to get as many technologies out to the world as possible. We're trying to serve the technology, not make money. We're a nonprofit.
You get any royalties?
Yes, in principle, all the inventors at MIT share in royalties. So if royalty money does come back in, then some small part of that ends up going to the inventors and is shared among the inventors. So, yeah.
At Brandeis, it's 50% of the royalty. That's after the lawyers are paid. And so, for instance, the deal I have with the university is that I'll spend 30 minutes on a patent. So I have other colleagues who will spend hundreds of hours on a patent. Then the lawyer costs are much lower, and then it could cost up to $100,000 to prosecute a patent. So you have to have the license revenue has to exceed that before the professor ever sees anything. But my business model is I survive off of the grants from the federal government, and so I'll do patents, but I won't invest the time in it. But there's other colleagues who really put a lot of time into the patent writing, and then their return will be much higher.
So my question kind of goes to that. And so for those who don't know, it wasn't until a court decision in 1985 that universities could be the the assignees for the patents. So that all changed in 1985. So do you think MIT would ever be, about the patents? You're great leaders in open education and open access and making a stand in being open licensing. I mean, I know you kind of do that, but making a stand and saying we are open license. Do you think you'd ever do that?
Well, so like I said, I think on average we're not really making a lot of money on
Right.
patents, right?
Right.
I think they try to run a break-even operation, but
Right.
as you just heard, it costs a lot of money to prosecute a patent. It can indeed cost
It can, but you
tens
could,
to $100
patent costs $270 to file.
if you have no experts working on it, right?
Correct.
So but if you want to do it well,
It's because of our legal system that
Yeah.
it's become that way.
if you want to do it well and you want to engage lawyers, it costs a lot of money to do a patent. And so those costs have to come back somehow, or you wouldn't do them. So,
Right.
and that is an option. And in fact, this happens sometimes at MIT, where MIT as a system will sort of look at a technology and say, well, we could invest a lot of money in this, but we could also just,
Right.
publish it and leave it out there. And I will say the following, that everything that gets done on the MIT campus is published and available to the world. Everything. Some things are patented first, but everything is put out there for the whole world. There's no secret work done on the MIT campus. So we are very open in our scholarship. No, there's no secret work done on campus.
Maybe the
period.
DARPA money, the DARPA funding stuff.
Nope,
Nope?
it's not allowed to be secret, period. We have a Lincoln laboratory up in,
Right.
and they do some government work, but it's not part of campus. It's a separate sort of
Right.
like subsidiary, and it's affiliated, but it's not
Right.
campus. So.
I was just kind of curious, if you're getting grant money, do you, after you publish your papers, where do you tend to like put your data in, like what repositories do you use, or where do you store things so that other people can find it and maybe use it?
GitHub is, GitHub usually.
I think where people have large data sets, it tends to be fairly organic what they do with it. So some people, at MIT we have a large server bank that they call DSpace, which you're allowed to sort of dump everything on and make it publicly available. And so we have that. Other people will put it on other repositories online. And there's no sort of set policy on what one has to do with it.
It's mainly useless. So raw data it's useless to me. Data has to be interpreted to have value. The whole point of publishing the paper is I put my spin on the data. And without that interpretation, it's worthless. I have terabytes of images, but if you don't have the right perspective, you're not going to extract you're going to extract very little from the raw data. This is a major problem because the government is requiring us each year to do more and more of this archiving, but it's largely useless. And even worse than useless, it's expensive and and of no value. So you're wasting time and money. So this is a major problem. We really need to have some kind of common universal format, that you could extract the information you want. But I'm not sure it's possible. Not at this kind of cutting edge, ragged edge of research where really your interpretation is critical. So I'm not sure. Anyway, I know of no solution. I've been on a bunch of panels at NSF. I've never seen one solution. I've never been at one panel where anything but cynicism reigned supreme. That the scientists are just rolling their eyes, but they keep coming at us more and more. We need this transparency. We need this archiving for 5 years, and I think it's just a waste. But it would be great if someone came up with some way that it wouldn't be a waste. Because we're required to do it, and we'd rather do it well than crappy. Now we're doing it really poorly.
I think some of the data librarians in the audience might might be able to help you with that. Perhaps. I know it's debatable.
But I'd love to get you to talk to the NSF guys, because
Oh, yes. Yes.
We have some opinions about what they ask for.
Yeah.
Anyways, my question is, like, for
Do you want
material
to show me a
sciences. Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
do you want to moderate, or should we pick, you want us to pick?
Yeah. For material sciences and other engineering disciplines, there's a lot of entrepreneurship and a lot of trial and error and failure. How do you encourage students to take chances and to fail, to try new things? I've seen a lot, at least a lot of, I guess, concerns within the faculty I work with, that students are sometimes often very concerned on like getting it right the first time or about the grade, and they're not ready, they're not resilient enough to take chances.
If they don't break things, they're not working hard enough. And if they don't break something expensive, they're not, being adventuresome.
I'm not sure so first of all, everything you just said is, we say that to the students sort of explicitly, right? So that we expect them to take chances. We expect them to fail. I think at MIT, I was talking about this at lunch a little bit with some folks, that at MIT, everyone who comes to MIT is wildly successful to have gotten there. And then they very quickly have to get comfortable that half of them are below average, right? And that's like everybody, the faculty, the students, everybody, right? So, so I think failure is a routine thing, and I think even the most successful people at MIT talk about their failures all the time and learn from their failures, and so I think it is part of the ecosystem. Okay.
Yeah, I love failure. That's how I ended up as a librarian. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't failed. No, I mean that seriously and in a good way. And my question is also somewhat failure related. I would like to talk about the business side of things in terms of the applications. We see all of this amazing wizardry in these developments that you both have showed that are incredibly fascinating, but I feel as though we often hear about these things, and then as far as actual products that come to market, there's a really big gap where we hear about this amazingly promising technology, and then, I mean, I might just not know how these things shake out in the wash, but it seems like many ideas, even that seem very good, for whatever reason, don't get there. So I wondered if you could talk about the business environment, maybe either economic or political realities that keep these things from being realized, anything along those lines. I'm interested to hear your take.
So you are speaking to sort of a pretty common theme in the world of technology, that there's the so-called valley of death between what goes on in labs and what makes it to the market. And I think that is sort of a real thing, that a lot of what happens in the lab, the standard to raise funds to do research is different than the standard to invest in development of a technology. Those are two very different communities evaluating viability, and I think they have a tendency to drift apart. And so it is, and I think it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and we're trying always to correct. It's entirely possible for researchers in the ivory tower to develop a definition of novelty that it's really far out there, and it's not going to make it to the market for a long time. And we need people to do that. We need people to be thinking out 20 or 30 years. And so they go off and they do it, and you hear about their successes, and they foreshadow what might come, and it will be decades before it happens. But it's also possible for researchers to spiral off and do things that might genuinely never be useful. I think that's part of the system, and in fact we kind of want that to happen. You have to try a lot of crazy things before some make it, right? So there's that. And then on the other side, the market knows what it wants, like now, right, or next year, and the market doesn't really look out 10 or 20 years very well. And so that system also puts a bias on, and that's in a different direction. And so the things that get across that bridge are few, and it does require a special breed of people who speak both languages to try to bridge those things. I'm not sure that's a satisfactory answer, but it's definitely the case that these are two worlds that meet at that interface. And in order for technology to transfer, you need people who understand both worlds.
But as a consumer, when I started my graduate studies, things that I spent 6 months, 10 months on, they do now in a day. And so there's literally, there's no question from every point of the technology I've been involved in, there's been 100-fold increase in, 30 years. And that's just incredible, 2 orders of magnitude increase. I mean, I feel like, I don't know, superhuman today in the lab compared to when I was a grad student. The kinds of things I can do in my daily so because of all these companies that have been successful. So I just feel like the failure rate is like negligible, And so maybe 1 out of 10 companies succeeds, but there's so much success. We're so much more powerful than we were when I was a grad student.
I think a lot of the success also is under the hood to your average consumer, right? But if you look at all the things around you and you think about a 20-year time frame, everything gets better, right? Everything. Your lawnmower got better. Your dishwasher got better. Like, everything gets better. Well, yes, there are revolutionary things. That didn't exist before. But even the sort of mundane things, they're a lot better. They're smaller. They're lighter. They're greener. Everything is better. And although that innovation started in the lab and has come out, you don't perceive it because you had a microwave 20 years ago. You still got a microwave. You don't really perceive the incremental evolutionary improvement of those things. But it happens, right?
We'll get to it.
Do you think that the current educational system, you mentioned you have little kids, I'm assuming they were little, is it helping them to learn in the way that they'll be able to function in this new society, this new academic world? Because I remember times when don't kind of shut down that curiosity, that stuff that was happening.
Well, I live in a unusual corner of the universe at MIT, I think, but I have never been more optimistic about the generation of young people coming through. I shouldn't talk about my own kids, probably. I'm not always 100% optimistic on, but no, I mean the generation coming through MIT is remarkably well trained, and as I said, they know what they want. They have a mission. They're exceptionally well trained. I have to thank computer games that the students coming in today think in 3 dimensions in a way that, like, I can't, because I grew up on paper and with, Pac-Man, but they grew up in a 3D world. Like, they visualize things better. They really are uniquely trained and talented, and they're on a mission. I think there's every reason to be optimistic about what we're doing with our youth. I think the STEM education movement has been remarkable for the students that I see.
Well, I mean, nationally, we have huge problems, of course, right? I mean, Boston and our children, of course, are, privileged, but there's many in this country that are not. And, and the education system and the direction that this country is doing in public education is terrible, and it's going to weaken this country as we continue. The elite are doing awesome. I mean, masters of the universe, but we have whole segments of our society that are being left behind, and the social investment is, just the way we're the only industrialized country in the world that uses property taxes to fund education. It's the most regressive form of social policy you can enact, and it has consequences. So there's societal problems, but in this corner, the Cambridge and children of academics, we're doing great. Yeah, the 1%ers are doing awesome.
Well, so I'll object to that ever so slightly, without getting political or objecting to any of the things you just said. MIT doesn't draw locally for students, right? We draw from the entire globe, and I will say that, like, students from all over the world, and maybe it is only the 1%ers from all over the globe. I don't think that's true, though. I think we are fairly blind to privilege, and we are very receptive to talent, and so those students are amazing. Like, I don't care where they came from; they're amazing.
But no one's going to say MIT's representative.
No, neither will I.
But MIT
I'm going to go
awesome.
ahead and lighten the subject just a touch.
So I have very briefly in my life worked with a carbon nanotube manufacturer. It was about 10 years ago, and nanotechnology was like the buzzword, right? I've kind of heard it's fallen out a little bit, and I didn't know if that's because it just blew up to encompass like everything, because so much falls under nanotechnology now, where it was a more pointed term, or I just wondered if you could speak to the evolution of that particular term in your discipline.
Sure. So I guess my perspective on the sort of movement, as it were, is there was this moment in time where it was a really useful thing for everyone to learn what nanotechnology was. Nanotubes are sort of like a symbol of nanotechnology. They're not the only thing in nanotechnology. But it was about raising awareness that in the end, everything is made of nano constituents, everything, right? That's what my field is about. And I think as a method of sort of raising awareness, that was a good movement. And it is a successful movement in the sense that now we don't have to talk about it all the time because everyone knows what it is, and it does drive innovation in every kind of material science. It's all about the nanoscale. And everybody now does it sort of routinely. It's just part of what we do. So you don't see it everywhere, and we don't focus on it as much, but it's pervasive. And so maybe it's a success story.
I mean, I've been told by congressional staffers that it's passé. You know, the Congress has a 20-year, you can use a buzzword for about 20 years, 15 to 20 years. And so now the new one is materials genomics coming out of NSF, which was a MIT coinage. So the people in NSF don't want to go to Congress with nanotechnology anymore because the Congress, they said, we've heard that, we've been funding it, you know, you have to declare success and move on. And so the new name is materials genomics.
This is like a much broader, but I'd be interesting to hear. So I'm just going to use Claude Shannon's theory of information, which took literally almost over a decade or more, to come to fruition for people to figure out how to apply it, and then, you know, voila, the digital world. But we're moving so fast, as you indicated, and I think one of the challenges is not only is our legal system not keeping up with this, but how are you as scientists and as professors in an institution helping to train other scientists on ethics, right? So like I used to work in the search engine, and like, believe me, we were so happy. We were like, we're gonna be able to know what everybody does. Okay, so now, like, right? So now I'm like, oh man, 10 years later, whoa, right? Like, we were so engrossed with that. So I'll be interested to hear, kind of as you're proctoring and tutoring people and kind of getting them to this, how do we, right, learn from our mistakes and then move forward to, right, get into some of these more meatier types of challenges?
Well, at Brandeis, I think, I'm sure at MIT as well, we have, you know, formal classes in ethics that all the postdocs and graduate students in sciences have to take. We have, you kind of go through playing roles in various different kinds of situations where ethics would come in, from publication to interpersonal relations to harassment issues, and we do, these role games and facilitated training that's kind of substantive. And so we have formal mechanisms, and then of course in each lab there's a certain culture of ethical standards, but we also institutionally have programs that are also increasingly, NIH and NSF have different standards, but we're at Brandeis, we're increasingly, kind of combining them all.
I was thinking more of like when they leave, right? I'm just gonna use my own case, which is, I got something like that too. And then I got in the business world, and you were like, very profit driven. So, some of the things how you were gonna like figure out at what level you were gonna step back, right? And that's, I think, the question when you're actually in a different environment that isn't, right? Not everybody's playing on the same game, because you're like, I've mortgaged my house and I gotta make this work, right? Because my family's gonna go hungry.
So I think I understand your question. It's sort of like, technologists, we focus so much on, can we do it? Right. And we don't often always ask, should we do it, right? And sort of encouraging that discussion early on is definitely part of the educational process. I feel, so at MIT, we are always pushing to integrate engineers with social scientists and humanities folks, and I think we should continue to do more of that. I think to be a good technologist, you have to be well-rounded and educated, and I think it's a critical part of the training. And a lot of the technologies that are getting developed, there are serious questions of, should we do this, and who should have oversight, and who are the stakeholders? Yeah, I'm with you. I think these are very important things going forward.
Has anyone in your program been asked to collaborate with any artists for new materials, for new creations?
Funny you should ask. So in our department, we one of the things you can do with materials is you can make objet d'art, and we actually operate a glass and ceramics facility. We operate a metal forge, metalworking facility. I have on staff 2 professional artists with MFA degrees who teach classes in the art of materials and how to make art with materials. And amongst our alumni, we have illustrious connections into the art world, including the owner and operator of the world's largest art foundry, who makes installation sculptures with the world's finest artists. So we run a lecture series where artists come and speak. So we care actually quite a lot about it, and our students do invent things that get applied in the world of art. So, incidentally, 3D printing is the rage in the world of sculpture right now. So.
I'm wondering, how do the subspecialties in materials science tend to organize? Is it like by material, by the types of questions being looked at?
I'm trying to think with the MRS, I would say the organization is more by industry.
Yeah, I would say if you go back 20 years, it was an amalgam by material. And so I worked on metals, someone else worked on ceramics, someone else worked on polymers. It started that way. But I would say in a very healthy evolution, we no longer see it that way any longer. The basic principles of how you engineer a material, it's thermodynamics, it's kinetics, it's mechanics, and those turn out to be quite general no matter what the flavor of material is. And the same sets of equations kind of apply to them all with minor tweaks. And so at MIT, I think I used this word before, it's materials Catholic. And that's kind of the way we view it. When we teach a class on materials processing, you learn how to bend the equations, the continuum equations, and apply them to every type of material manufacturing. So I would say it doesn't factionate in that way any longer. It tends to now organize more by function and application.
So when you say by industry, what would be some examples?
Medical device, electronic, packaging, aeronautics, engine turbine, powertrain.
And part of that change is that by industry, by application, now people who are material scientists, they no longer have a single community, right? They have multiple communities. So I will go to a conference on 3D printing for aerospace, and next week I'll go to one on ceramics for actuators. And we have multiple communities because we're materials Catholic.
Hi, you actually just made me think of a question. So how do you keep up with current literature given the breadth of stuff that your discipline overlaps with?
Yeah, nobody keeps up with everything.
I realize that, but I mean, do you have, you've got feeds that, do you have feeds that push things to you? Do you have journals that you particularly like or go to all the time? Do you base it on, who's publishing the thing that you're interested in and you track them specifically? Just from a librarian perspective and how I do this stuff, I'm just curious from your perspective how you execute the task.
So again, I'm just speaking for myself. So conferences, day after tomorrow, I'm going to a conference in Mexico. The next week, Switzerland. 2 weeks later, China. So then, they're in different fields. I kind of publish in 4 different fields. So then, with different conferences, then I review articles in those fields, and so I kind of know there. I sit on grant committees for different agencies, the military, the National Science Foundation, so I see things there. And so through all those kinds of mechanisms, you're a member of this professional society. And then there are the journals that I publish in and that I, scan.
Yeah, I'll sort of agree with that. That I think that the way that faculty tend to do it is it's a networking thing more than a feed thing for the faculty. They circulate, the quality filters out through the community, right? So the vast explosion in the literature is mostly at the bottom end of the quality range that doesn't impact what you're doing, right? So it's a giant pyramid, and what the faculty are trying to do is figure out what the really good stuff is. And so it's about filtering. So merely having a feed, I think, just gives you too much information. And I think the way people do it is ad hoc. They circulate. They go to conferences. They sort of they're looking for venues that help identify the quality work. And that does mean that they look at specific journals regularly, no question. So the journal, I think, has the important attribute of sort of aggregating the highest quality work for a community.
So as a follow-up to that, it sounds like given your time in the field, you establish some filters, some mental filters that you use when you look at things. You know, you have certain people in your department that you know give you great recommendations, and so you're going to listen to them more. How do you translate that to, in particular, your graduate students, since they're most likely going to need to use those skills going forward?
So as a graduate student, that's the one thing I was always looking at my advisor. You know, I had a very illustrious advisor, and you know, basically he could, you know, he was incredibly brilliant, and so he could work on anything. And so I was always striving to understand, why did he work on this and not that? You know, how do you separate the wheat from the chaff? And you know, so I asked him that, and he told me. So this guy's a physicist, so this is going to be a physics answer. It's not a material science answer. So he said, look for something that has generality and universality. So that's a value that physicists hold dear. That when I study something, I'm not going to just learn about this color stripe pattern. I'm going to learn about all colors in the universe. You know, something that transcends that particular subsystem you're looking at. That's you know, that was a value judgment that he would make. And so if there was two interesting phenomena, two gaudy things that, you know, catch your attention, then he would say the one that had more depth and generality. And basically, that's the only sensible advice I've ever gotten, and I give it to my students. That's the only guidance I've got, and several times it's served me well, where I've identified fields that were emergent and then directed resources into them, and then we've become you know, forerunners by applying that criteria. Yeah. It's very specific. I mean, that's a physics.
That's the right answer. The right answer is that this is our role as faculty, is to train graduate students to be discerning critics of science, right? And to identify the wheat from the chaff. And it's different in every little subfield, but that is the critical skill. Because in the explosion of information, what's happening is that we're tending to replace that critical judgment with metrics, right? Yeah. So impact factors and citations, and this is all artificial BS that sort of steers the field completely in the wrong directions. Yeah. And I mean, the very minute you try to measure something on a human, humans react and manipulate it, and that's exactly what's happening. But you cannot manipulate what is really quality science and what is not, right? And so it requires expert judgment. It is the only value in the game. So that is what we teach our students.
And do both of your schools' departments have like research methods courses for graduate students, or does it just happen sort of on an advisor-advisee level?
I think it's that advisor-advisee relationship is the key thing here, because it's very field-specific, right? And it's very domain-specific. And no one can lead you through the forest except the Sherpa who knows the forest, right?
The most important quality in a scientist is creativity. And I've asked myself hundreds of times, how come there's no course in creativity in my university, or, I don't know, many universities that teach how to be creative? And I believe that one can teach creativity. I don't believe you're born, you know, that it's you either have it or you don't. You can nurture it and grow it. And I don't know why we don't teach that.
I feel like if we had some kindergarten teachers running a class like that, you'd be all set.
You know, I'm gonna, next time we have a hire in our department.
I have one quick, so my comment is that a group of starlings flying like that is called a murmuration.
That's correct.
Yes. And then I wanted to ask for the active material, do you have any sense of what that could become? Do you, when you're working on it, do you have a vision going forward, or is it just that this is something that exists now that you're interested and curious
Okay,
about?
we plant seeds and you get trees and then you got to cut them up into wood and hammer them into a house. I just want to plant a seed and grow a house.
So do you?
We're working on it, actually.
Okay.
But I'm not joking.
Thank you so very much. This is fantastic.